We want to work with a sense of urgency because we're feeling that as we look over education reform in our state, we've made some impressive results, and we're pleased by those results, and we want to take the time to celebrate those results. We've made progress, and at the same time, when we step back and look at our results, one disturbing fact is that educational attainment still correlates with socioeconomic status in Massachusetts, as virtually everywhere else in the country. But that was a promise of education reform, that we would have an education system that delivered excellence and equity to all, and that the disadvantages of poverty, for example, would not interfere with a student's capacity to achieve at high levels. So we're concerned about that and what more we need to do to deliver on that promise. Beyond that, we want to ask the question, if after 14 years of education reform, we continue to see significant performance gaps, and those gaps are associated with poverty, what more do we need to do to help children who deal with the injuries of poverty, the disadvantages of poverty, to come to school ready and available to learn at high levels, even if we're successful in optimizing instruction in our classrooms in the Commonwealth. Because the nature of standards-based school reform has forced us to see that schooling alone, 180 days a year, 6 hours a day, somewhere around 15% of a child's life between birth and age 18, isn't going to create an equal playing field for kids from poor backgrounds and kids from affluent backgrounds. So the results keep telling us we're not there yet. And it keeps us asking the question, what do we need to do a better job? How do we need to, if we view the core business of education as teaching and learning, what do we need to do to optimize that transaction in classrooms all across the Commonwealth? And now I'm even asking, the question I'm posing here is, that in itself may not be enough. Even if we can optimize instruction, we may still have achievement gaps because kids bring into school so many other impediments that get in their way that, at least in the subgroup kind of calculation of achievement gap, we're still going to have problems. And we need to be attentive of that. We now have an accountability system that, for example, is forcing more and more schools into a category where they are called out for underperformance and need help. It's not coincidental that many of those schools have high proportions of low-income youngsters in them. So one theory of action in terms of turning around the performance of such schools is somehow, coincidentally, all the incompetence in the field of education has aggregated around schools in which there are high proportions of low-income kids. Another theory of action would be there's something about poverty, there's something about the predicament of those youngsters that gets in the way of their being able to take advantage of even optimized systems of teaching and learning. And so I'm more somebody who believes in the latter analysis, that we have a lot of high-quality educators working in circumstances in urban environments where they're up against some very significant impediments that the children bring in the front door with them. Did we envision that there were going to be problems in places like this? Not necessarily, but we envisioned that you'd need to periodically look at the job that needs to be done as we describe it through our standards. And then you'd have to have an honest look at what kind of resources were required in order to do that. And I think there's been kind of a collective active avoidance on Beacon Hill at some level in addressing that, because there was justifiable fear, and I had this fear myself, frankly, that when you have the adequacy discussion, for some people it could conceivably be a blank check exercise. Or for others, it could be an excuse to say, well, you can't really hold us accountable because you haven't given us adequate resources with which to do the job. And the position I take on this is we ought to ask the question about adequacy, but the question of asking the question about adequacy, and even if we find we don't have adequate resources, as I expect we won't, to do the job that we're trying to do, because the data certainly show us year in and year out that we're not there yet, that doesn't alleviate anybody of the burden of accountability. We're spending, as a state, more money on education than anything else we buy. We're making a huge investment in our education systems. And we know we can do a better job, and we know it's possible because we've got lots of instances, we've got lots of individual schools around who can take low-income youngsters, for example, and educate them to high standards. So we know it can be done if adults can get the conditions of learning right. It's a question of how you make that happen. And I think from time to time we have to ask the question of how much money is required to do the job. Bearing in mind, and I'm as aware of it as anybody, that there's a rich body of research that shows there's not a pure production function in education between supplying more resources and improving outcomes.